before even questioning him about this, they put together a SWAT-level raid and performed a no-knock raid at 6 o'clock in the morning, and within 30 seconds of knocking on the door, they killed Brian Malinowski.
For those who prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery, the assault on the Second Amendment couldn't be more dangerous. Yet gun rights have been making a steady comeback in recent years. Find out how today on Restoration Spotlight. I'm Hayden Ludwig. The individual right to bear arms expressed in the Constitution was not an afterthought, but rather a prescription against gun confiscation. Americans in 1788 were all too aware of one such tyrannical act just 4 decades before, when the English Parliament defeated Scottish Highlanders fighting for national independence and promptly disarmed them forever. The lesson for colonial America was clear. Gun ownership is tied to liberty, gun confiscation to subjugation. It's no less true today, with a grasping federal government that justifies every assault on our constitutional freedoms with an appeal to national security, and a predatory left that wants nothing more than to exploit a disarmed nation. My guest today is an expert on both counts. Bronson Winslow is an investigative researcher for Restoration News, here to discuss the state of gun rights in 2026. So let's start with an overview of the war between those who would limit and confiscate firearms and those like yourself who's defending them. Who's winning that fight right now?
The left was using lawfare and the federal powers, as well as swaying public opinion, to pretty much choke out anyone who wanted to support an absolute Second Amendment right, the constitutional interpretation of the Second Amendment. But we've seen that change recently, and it's been a very positive change, and it's been multiple aspects that have kind of all brought that into focus. Obviously, Donald Trump coming into power in 2024, he has overstepped a plethora of Biden policies that pretty much choked out gun dealers and just the regular citizen who would want to buy a shotgun. The amount of red tape from the ATF, which is supposed to be a simple regulatory agency, simply became more of a behemoth, a weapon that Biden was able to wield when Congress would not submit to his own gun control agenda. But now that Donald Trump has taken his stand, he's followed up on a lot of his campaign promises to gun owners and Second Amendment advocates to make sure that he puts a stop to that, and he has. We saw within the first month of him taking office an executive order that required the DOJ to review all Second Amendment laws and policies in the nation and to kind of create a guidepost for America to shift back towards a real Second Amendment, a Second Amendment that truly represents the people. Wow. And we've seen that. It's been a slow progression, as anything is in the government, but we've seen giant strides towards what we would like. And now we have a Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which is huge. It's not only an executive order that says, hey, we need to address this, we need to fix this. It's actually a body inside of the Department of Justice that is their main goal, is to kind of review everything that has been going on and say, hey, these are the key points where the American people are being persecuted. This is the road path that I would build out for us to be able to fix that problem.
So that's run by Harmeet Dillon in the Justice Department. And what you're saying is, normally when we think of Justice Department, Office of Civil Rights Division, it's usually to, accuse white people of being racist and to chase down conservatives and Trump supporters. But this is like fighting fire with fire. It's creating an office that's designed to find anti-gun rules, regulations, legislation across the whole country and do what they can to sweep it back. Do I have that right?
Yes, and in some ways, it's almost fighting fire with fire. We've seen almost 15 years of federal overreach, and this is not in any form of federal overreach, but it's a true example of the federal government prioritizing the citizens' constitutional rights. But it takes from a playbook that we've seen the left, where they've used these non-elected officials and these regulatory agencies to bypass Congress and simply be like, the Second Amendment is up to our interpretation. We are going to use these background channels to pretty much squash any form of gun ownership in the country. And for the longest time, they got away with it. And the American people were the ones who suffered.
Let's talk about a lot of the battle over gun rights centers on courtrooms. It's very unsexy. It's very much, a handful of lawyers battling it over sometimes very sweeping big issues, but often it's very, minor particular details here. But you've pointed out there's one that's in the Supreme Court right now that is massive, and it involves Hawaii. Give us the background on that.
Yeah, so last year, the legislative body in Hawaii decided that concealed carry was just no longer something that they wanted. They believed that it conflicted with the spirit of aloha. I'm not truly sure what that means, but
Nobody
that
knows
was
what
the
the spirit of
basis.
aloha is.
Yes,
I mean, it means hello, goodbye. So let's be honest. Nobody knows what that actually means.
yes, but they failed to see that that ruling completely conflicts with any form of precedent in the Supreme Court as to what an individual can carry under the Second Amendment, and that it trails back to the Bruin decision that made it so any form of gun control policy or firearm restriction, there needs to be a root in the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States. And the spirit of aloha might be very important to the people of Hawaii, but it is not rooted in the historical tradition of firearm gun ownership. So
Sure.
next Tuesday, the Supreme Court will take that up, and arguments will begin over whether or not that passes constitutional muster. And it's very likely that it will not.
And that would be a huge deal for protecting that, because there you have a blue state run entirely by Democrats with Democrat judges attempting to just simply whisk away a key aspect of your Second Amendment rights, which is the right to conceal carry a firearm. They're simply saying you just don't have one. We just don't let you do that. It's inconsistent. But the key thing here you pointed out is that it actually, well, how do we decide whether that's legitimate or not? It goes back to a prior Supreme Court ruling. I believe it was 21 or 22 was the Bruin decision, correct? Tell us more about that.
Well, the Bruin decision is possibly the greatest precedent set for the Second Amendment in decades. It stripped down a lot of language that was being spewed around of like, how do we see if these laws are reaching constitutional muster? And there was a lot of confusion for a long time until the Supreme Court took up the Bruin case, and they sat down and they decided that there needs to be a framework, and that framework became, does it constitute what the founding fathers and the origin of this country mean by the Second Amendment? Can we find laws in the early days of our country that show that this is an okay thing to regulate, or this passes that constitutional muster of a smart protection for the Second Amendment, but also a protection for, taking rights and running rampant with them? And they found that there aren't many examples that work with today's form of gun control. There aren't a plethora of gun restrictions in the early days of our country. There was just good, honest people who held firearms, defended their homes, and were ready to come together and fight forms of tyranny that would be levied upon them. And now we have thousands and thousands of forms of gun control that are almost pitched as these protections for the people, but in all honesty, they just continually strip the rights of the people. And that's what Bruin did. They took it back to the basics. They stepped it down and they said, hey, if these laws do not align with our historical tradition of firearm regulation, they have to go. And we've seen them go. There's been lovely cases all across the country. Most recently in California, they had bans on open carry in counties that had more than 100,000 residents. And the Ninth Circuit Court said, hey, this does not pass the Bruin test. This is a right of the people to open carry. So it got struck down, and now it's back into disarray, and I'm sure it will continue in the courts. But we've seen Bruin come in and shut down these laws that many blue states are trying to push on their people.
That's incredible. It's kind of a silver bullet, actually. I think one of the key aspects of that's interesting as conservatives is we naturally read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and wonder what were the men who wrote it, what was in their minds. And that's codifying that kind of thinking, originalist jurisprudence into how every gun regulation is seen. So, for instance, if you just take the phrase, a well-regulated militia, a progressive hears that in 2026 and goes, oh, so regulate the magazine size, the barrel of the gun, who can buy it, age restrictions, maybe racial restrictions, et cetera, when actually all it meant is that you know how to use your weapon. that you drill regularly with it. It's actually the complete opposite meaning of regulation is how they use it today, because for them, regulated means it's hard to get, it's costly, it's difficult to obtain, that sort of thing. So that those words actually matter.
I 100% agree. They view it completely differently. Well regulated back in the day meant there was a chain of command and there was a sense of honor and integrity within this unit, that they weren't a reckless band of individuals that were going out to cause mayhem and destruction. They were a centralized unit of people that believed in their country or their locality. And in the case where things did happen to go south, they were ready to work together to protect the things that they loved. That form of regulation is good. We like to see organized regulation of people following the Constitution, but we don't want to tell a hunter that if he gets caught with more than 10 rounds in his gun, that he could face a felony charge. There's many instances when you're hunting where you need more than 10 rounds, where a hunt can become form of a kind of a form of a survival, where sometimes you become prey if you're hunting large animals, and to tell him that, oh, you can only have 10 rounds is it's not a smart policy. And that's just one policy of so many policies that don't truly make sense. I mean, the left hasn't even been able to define what a so-called assault rifle is in the last 25 years. So that should tell you all you need to know about their logic behind these laws.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of going south, let's talk about Virginia. So we now have a new Democrat governor, Abigail Spanberger. You and I both live in the state. And so far, you are tracking dozens of new gun control bills. Well, put it this way. You have written at restoration-news.com that in Governor Youngkin's outgoing year, there were 54 gun control bills proposed that were vetoed by the Republican governor. So, in other words, we're looking at potentially 54 new gun control bills being reintroduced where they're not going to get vetoed by a Democrat. Whatever the final number is, let's talk about how radical those are and whether those will pass the Bruin test.
I mean, from what I've seen so far, I think there's 11 pre-filed bills right now that deal with the Second Amendment. I don't think any of them can pass the Bruin test, but also I'm not a lawyer, so I haven't broken it down fully.
This isn't legal advice.
This is not legal advice, but they're all authoritarian. They want to restrict magazine capacity, which is time and time again been proven that it's just a bad policy. It doesn't do anything to protect anyone. They also want to ban the sale of ARs. They put a nice little caveat in there that if you own an AR, you're fine. You don't have to sell it, but you can't sell it to anyone else. You can't trade it, and you can't buy any new ones. So they're restricting an entire sect of firearms for people to be able to buy. And that's just not a good policy. And we've seen that in the court system. We've seen it struck down and time and again. We've known that the Bruin test will apply to that. So they can go ahead and they can push it through. And it might stand for a second, and then it might spiral into the court systems. But as long as the Bruin test is there, it will eventually be cast down, because it's not the law of the land. It does not follow the Constitution. And when we get away from that and we stray from that, we're in a gray area where the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. Laws are up to the interpretation of whatever the people would like, and we can't get to that position. And especially in Virginia, there's only 11 pre-filed, but those 54 bills only were stopped because Governor Youngkin went in and he vetoed every single one of them. And he was truly a defender of the Second Amendment for Virginians. He took a stand early on, and every single time it came across his desk, he made sure to strike it down. We're no longer in that position. We've lost a lot of power in Virginia, and unfortunately, these bills probably will make it through, but then it becomes our goal to make sure that Bruin is enforced and to make sure that the court system is going by the law of the land and what is considered up to par with constitutional muster.
I'm going to ask you to be a little philosophical here for a moment, but why is the Second Amendment important? I think people understand why free speech is important, especially in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder last year. People can understand why political speech is an important thing to protect. Why is it important to protect access to something like an AR-15 or to have a handgun regardless of the magazine size? Why is that important as a right as opposed to a privilege? And the flip side of this is, why is the progressive left so adamant that we should not have that right, to curtail it at every possible opportunity?
The Second Amendment is the right that protects all rights. Without it, the Constitution is simply a piece of paper. When
Ah,
you take away the ability for the populace to take a stand against anyone who would infringe on their constitutional rights, you've taken away the power of the people. And I honestly believe that is a lot of what we see with gun control these days, is removing the power of the people, because it quite literally is the right that enshrines all rights. So I think it's immensely important for people to realize it's not about being able to have a really cool gun that can have 25 to 30 rounds. That is a part of it, and
sure.
really cool guns are really cool. But it's also the very, very almost base primal understanding that if we cannot defend ourselves, we are no longer citizens. We've become subjects. And any forms of power over us can do as they please, and we have absolutely no say so. And it honestly surprises me that the left is against the Second Amendment. They are on a war path against the government currently, and they are
Interesting.
doing everything they can to overthrow any forms of democracy in the republic. And you would think as they do that, they would want to be armed, but they don't seem to understand that the Second Amendment protects everyone. It doesn't matter what your beliefs are. It's there so that if you feel that you're being infringed, you have a form of protection. But they seem to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and think the government will be nice to them if it does turn evil. It doesn't quite square with their own logic. But the conservative party and the mass as a whole, we understand that if things ever did go bad, we have that right, and they cannot take that right away. And if they try to take that right away, that is the moment where we come together as a nation and we say, no, we will not be subjects. We are citizens. These are our rights. And this right allows us to protect the rest of those rights.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mentioned it in the opening, but the fact that a generation before the American Revolution, you have the English Parliament and King confiscating the firearms of every Englishman and Scotsman in the British Isles. That shows you the difference between those are now subjects. They're not citizens. I don't care what they call themselves today. They are subjects of the crown, subject to what the crown says they must do. And the American self-perception was adamantly no. That's not what even when we were colonists, we are not mere subjects. We are Englishmen with ancient English privileges and rights. And self-defense is a critical one going back, I mean, beyond Magna Carta, even to Alfred the Great against the Vikings. So this is so baked into the American DNA. And I wonder, Bronson, if you look at some of the assassination culture that's unfortunately developed in the last few years, thinking with obviously Charlie Kirk, but also the attempted assassination of President Trump in 2024, I wonder if that's changing on the left. And I wonder if in part it's changing, at least among younger leftists, where they're starting to realize exactly what you said. If I really do believe George Floyd is, menaced to death by the police and we live in a fascist police state, obviously I don't believe that. But if I was a leftist and I really thought that, why wouldn't I want to defend myself and be able to do that? I mean, you can't even say you trust the police at that point if you really believe, all cops are bastards and they're all out to get you. So I wonder if that's changing among young socialists.
I think it is. Just on social media and just scrolling through Twitter, I've seen leftists that I follow just to understand where they're coming from. I start to see some of them being like, do not vote for gun control. Do not give up your Second Amendment rights.
Interesting.
And it's a very interesting shift in the kind of the leftist movement. And it's interesting, but I also think even if there was a shift, it won't end as most people would assume. There would not be an overthrow of power and then a populace that continues with those ideals that we should have guns. We've seen throughout history that when leftist bodies take power through force, whoever they prop up into position to fill that vacuum normally confiscates the firearms. So it's almost like it's like the first thing they always do. So it's like a catch-22. Even if they do support gun rights now, it's almost as if they're using the Constitution properly, but almost for their own self-demise. So it is
Yeah.
an interesting thing to see recently of more leftists being like, we need to support the Second Amendment. We need a strong Second Amendment. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Going back to the theme of curtailing gun rights, let's talk about the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF. One of the things that I don't think I've seen anybody other than you write about was, if we go all the way back to the government shutdown in November 2025, leading right up through October and November 2025, I should say, one of the really concerning things was the ATF, of course, was shut down. Why does that matter? Because if you were in the middle of a background check, an application basically to buy a firearm, your application, your background check was put on hold until the government shutdown was resolved. In effect, your Second Amendment right to purchase a firearm lawfully within the system, right, was frozen in place, which shows you if the thing was shut down for a year, that's a 12-month period. You're not allowed, you basically don't have Second Amendment rights. So walk us through that, because that was a huge thing exposed by the government shutdown that I'm not sure maybe certain Second Amendment activists saw coming, but most of the American body politic did not see coming.
It's a dangerous precedent, and it also reveals how much power a bureaucratic agency holds over the Second Amendment. When you need the government's permission as well as funding just to buy a firearm, are you truly free? Like,
Yeah.
if you need a firearm, you cannot just go get it. And background checks somewhat remained during the shutdown, which was a nice portion of, I guess, grace from the federal government. There were some background checks going through, but major classifications and the people selling firearms and the middlemen between sales, the FFL carriers, they were not able to update their licenses, and many of them were stuck in a position where they could not work. And gun stores and resellers and any type of gun trade relies on an FFL. So if you cannot renew that, you do not have a business, you do not have an income. So not only was it infringing on the Second Amendment rights of us to simply carry a firearm, it was damaging the gun stores. It was hurting livelihoods because the government just said, oh,
Well, right.
we
How
don't
many
have
small
money.
businesses can go 30 plus days making payroll with virtually zero revenue coming in? That was really what a lot of companies looked at.
Yeah, it's hard to do it, and I think it's a good thing that we saw it, and it became kind of a more of a well-known idea that, hey guys, we have a Second Amendment, and we're fighting all these battles to make sure that we have the right to carry, but we've almost forgotten that the ATF holds all of this authority, and when they shutter their doors, the pretty much the Second Amendment kind of drags out to a very slow stop in the rest of the populace. And that's just not a good precedent. It's not a good system. And a few Republican congressmen did step up and they did put forth bills that in future shutdowns would make sure that funds were allocated and that all forms of regulation in the ATF were deemed essential. And that's a great thing to have, but I don't think it addresses the true problem. They don't need to have that power in the first place. We need to go ahead and review what the ATF can do as a regulatory agency, and we need to scale back anything that is deemed superfluous. We do not need an agency to check and dot every single portion of our lives when it comes to firearms.
Yes. Okay. So that's a good transition into talking about the ATF. You've done a lot on the history of this organization. This is not the FBI or the DEA, guys you expect to be dressed as SWAT units. These are essentially bureaucrats who are designed to regulate firearm purchases and ownership and federal firearm licenses, FFLs, but in fact has a very long history of acting as this kind of paramilitary organization. So let's go through some of that ugly track record there. And the goal here is to point out this is not a good organization trying its best and just making the occasional flop. Like the government shutdown wasn't the ATF's fault, right? This is an organization with a really seriously checkered past that brings into light exactly what you said. Maybe we don't want an ATF being the bottleneck for your Second Amendment rights. So with that, tell us more about the ATF.
The history is terrible. There's a lot of good things the ATF has done, and I don't want to strip that away from them. I think that what they do with explosives is important. Explosives probably should be somewhat regulated, but when you look at Ruby Ridge and you look at Waco and you look at Operation Fast and Furious, you're like, okay, so they have a history of murdering people and selling guns to the cartel. Maybe there needs more checks and balances over this agency.
That's the line. Yes.
Maybe they've run a bit too far, and it's been years since there was a major incident like that until in 2024 in March, the raid of Brian Malinowski. He was an ardent gun collector. He had amassed somewhere around 150 firearms over about a 3-year period, and he was known to visit gun shows and trade with collectors. And for some reason, the ATF saw that as a high-profile gun dealer that was purposely and intentionally breaking any form of firearm sale laws. But before even questioning him about this, they put together a SWAT-level raid and performed a no-knock raid at 6 o'clock in the morning. And within 30 seconds of knocking on the door, they killed Brian Malinowski. He simply woke up, grabbed a firearm, and defended his home from what he had no idea what it was, just some random people breaking into his house at 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And after that happened, people reviewed the case. They looked through it, and it was sanctioned. They said it was A-okay and it was ready to go.
Wow.
But it's impossible to look at this case and say, yes, we should have an ATF that can kick in the doors of lawful gun owners and murder them in their homes, all because they believe they may or may not have broken some form of firearm law. And when they reviewed the case, there is no true evidence that he was a gun dealer. He was simply a collector, someone who loved firearms and engaged with other collectors to trade weapons. It was a harmless thing he was doing, but he is now dead because we have a regulatory agency acting like a paramilitary organization, doing anything they can to enforce the regulations that they believe are set stone law.
So the people who've never heard this story follow it closely. So Brian Malinowski was the executive director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton International Airport in Little Rock, Arkansas. In other words, he's not man on the street. He is a prominent member of his community in very good standing. This is not a criminal, okay? This guy was flagged because he does what many men across the country do, and he buys a lot of firearms as is his purview to do so. And he did it entirely within the confines of the law. But they were tracking, big purchases, looking for people who might be illegally selling it. So he's on a list, in other words. And correct me if I'm wrong about these particulars. So they could have at any point sent a couple agents, armed or otherwise, to meet with Mr. Malinowski and interview him and try to establish, is this guy a criminal or is he just a guy who really likes his guns? Instead, they chose to treat him like he's the Unabomber or he's a terrorist, knocking on his door at 6 a.m. I mean, I'm barely cogent at 6 a.m., right? Who has time to get out of your bed, get dressed, go down to the front door, open it up in 30 seconds? So as far as we know, Malinowski probably thought, like you said, somebody's breaking in. They come in, they see he's got a weapon, and he's dead, very short period later. That's chilling. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you expect to find in like East Germany or China, not in modern America, for a guy who, as far as we know, did nothing wrong.
Yeah, it's terrible, and Arkansas is a castle doctrine state, so within the confines of what he was doing as a landowner and as a husband, he was simply waking up to an intruder and drawing his firearm to protect himself.
Wow.
And within a blink of an eye, there was a bullet in his head, and he was dead. And that's not something that we can permit nor allow to be swept under the rug as a sanctioned raid. That is a very cold murder of a law-abiding American by a regulatory agency that is acting out of its bounds and without congressional approval.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Everybody's okay with some form of firearm regulation, so a 5-year-old's not getting a handgun. We understand that. We understand there's some limitations on that. But this is not what conservatives have ever signed up for. And yet this is what we're getting more often than people realize. One of the things I'm interested that you've written about is how the Biden administration, you hinted at this earlier, used the ATF's sweeping power to regulate gun ownership to specifically target gun dealers that would make minor clerical mistakes and basically treat them like they're criminals. Right. So let's talk more about that, because that was a powerful weaponization of a regulatory body for 4 years that tried to, for a lot of small businesses, just run them into ground, into insolvency.
Yeah, the ATF under the Biden administration definitely became the gun control hand of the Biden administration. When Congress shut down all of Biden's gun control goals, he went to the ATF and they became the de facto honestly ruling body of the Second Amendment without any approval from our elected officials. And with that power, they created a new policy known as the zero tolerance policy. And it was kind of marketed as we're going to clean up, anything illegal in the gun market. We're going to make sure gun dealers are doing what they're supposed to do. But overnight, it became a Stasi for any form of failure, any simple failures, clerical errors, miscounted worksheets, anything that they could find where they could point to an issue, they would revoke their FFLs and they would shut them down. And FFL revocations in 2023 reached a 16-year high.
Wow.
And there was numerous businesses just completely wiped out. Families that were dependent on that income were completely just screwed by the federal government. And I spoke with multiple gun shop owners during that time, and they all told me the same story of, hey, I tried to work with them. I didn't mean to make this error. It wasn't a bad one. Like, there was nothing illegal happened. I just didn't file this firearm repair appropriately with this form. And the next thing you know, they're shutting me down and I can't get legal representation to get out of this. And I'm sitting there as a journalist listening to these stories. Like, I cannot help you other than to just tell people what you're going through. But it was truly horrendous to see a regulatory body be bolstered by the federal government, stepping over Congress to do exactly what they wanted, which was to reduce the number of gun stores in America. And they were successful. They shut down thousands of gun stores across the country.
Wow. Show me the man. I'll show you the crime. I mean, that's exactly what they were trying to do. So Bronson, as we close out here, what do you see coming down the pike? You study this issue all the time. You also study a lot around the crime and obviously some overlap there. So, we're still looking at 3 more years of the Trump administration. How do you see the Trump administration proceeding? What can the Office of Civil Rights in the Justice Department under Harmeet Dillon, what can it achieve, for instance? But also, what threats do you see coming that perhaps most law-abiding conservatives who love their gun rights may not be aware of?
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff coming, and both good things and bad things. On the good front, I think that the Civil Rights Division for the Second Amendment is going to do great things. I think they're going to have the manpower and the time to dig deep into blue states where layers and layers and years of gun control policy have almost made it impossible for law-abiding Americans to dig their way out. And I think they're going to assist them, and I think they're going to use Bruin and the court systems to actually start to strip away this illegal framework. So I would love to see the Department of Justice truly laying their foot down on unconstitutional laws. And coming forward on sort of a bad note, I think we're going to see a lot less silly gun control because they're realizing that it won't pass the Bruin test and they're wasting money in court trying to push this through. But I think we will start to see more financial infringement. I think we're going to see sneakier forms of gun control that come for your bank account, or different cryptocurrencies or centralized currencies that will block you from being able to purchase a firearm, or they will hike up the price of firearms and ammunition to make it very hard for you to buy. Because when they fail to restrict the gun itself, they're going to restrict every other means around the gun to prevent you from having it. So I think we'll see a lot less of silly laws, but I think we need to be very alert of the very sneaky laws, the things that target the wallets of everyday Americans and the things that kind of target the foundation of what you need in order to own a firearm.
Yes, 100%. Bronson Winslow, thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. Until next time, stay armed and trust in God.